All right, peace world. It's Patrick Kamon Freeman, Anger Black Man in Therapy, broadcasting live on We Act Radio on the radical side of Martin Luther King Avenue, the underbelly nation's capital, the foothill of Cedar Hill, the line of the concentrated Douglas home, the bicentennial in Washington, D.C. And we're so honored to have the renowned Professor Gerald Horne joining We Act Radio today. He is here to make sense of the Ukraine and Russia conflict, or the Biden-Putin conflict, and what we should all know and be doing about America being whores of OPEC. And maybe we could have a Green New Deal for this geopolitical conversation. Professor Horne is a Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, is also the author of The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, and Capitalism in 17th Century North America and the Caribbean. And he's also the author of the book that I possess, White Supremacy Confronted. Professor Horne, welcome to We Act Radio.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, I want to jump right into it. We're here to wrestle with, wow. First, let me open up. We do this a little differently. This is a libation. We get up for the ancestors. And today's shout out will go to Dr. Amos Wilson, who had this to say. Two white men deciding the fate of an earth that is majority non-white while we all praying they get along is evidence that we are all insane and the world is upside down. That was Amos N. Wilson. Dr. Wilson said this back in 1986 about Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev during the historic nuclear summit. And here we are in 2022 in a similar situation. We're confronting white supremacy when you just simply look at how the Western media has characterized from the struggle to the refugees as a result of this struggle. And I just think that is the 500-year-old institution white supremacy is on full display. Even Alexander Cortez acknowledged this, the disparity, the stark contrast, and how these refugees have been treated as opposed to other refugees around the world. But before we get into Ukraine, I got to start with the State of the Union and get your feedback on that. And I just want to say first and foremost that I want to thank Congresswoman Cori Bush, because I feel like Biden threw us under the bus a little bit. Speaking of a stark contrast, there was a stark contrast from his speech last year where he said that George Floyd changed the world. And now we can't even say defund the police. So I want to quote Martin Luther King right here. He says, there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but he must take it because conscience tells him it is right. So again, I want to thank Congresswoman Cori Bush for her unwavering position on defund the police. I'm with the sister there, because only the people who have never been violated by the police are the very ones who are trying to get us to stop saying defund the police. So that's a lot to unpack, Brother Horne, but I leave it on your capable hands. Take it from there, the State of the Union address.
Well, it was a mixed bag, basically. What I mean is, and also with regard to the point you just articulated, is that when you're drawing a contrast between what Mr. Biden said last year and what he says this year, one of the inferences that I draw is that our antagonist, the right wing, has engineered a counteroffensive. I'm doing a study, a book right now on the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles. And you may recall that his leader was the late Huey Newton, and Huey used to say that war is politics with bloodshed, and politics is war without bloodshed. And so if that is accurate, and I think it is, we're involved in a war, a political war. And so in a political war, be it in North America or be it in Eastern Europe, there can be offensives and counteroffensives. And right now, if you look at the forces on the battlefield in North America, we're at a disadvantage, and we've been at a disadvantage for hundreds of years. That is to say, let me just quote you one factoid amongst many. In 1991, the Euro-American population across class lines in Louisiana voted by 55%, 55 to 45, to elect as governor a leader of the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi Party. And that factoid is just an emblem of how backwards the Euro-American community across class lines can be. And historically, the way we've been able to overcome that is through international alliances, lengthening the battlefield. But alas, what's happened over the past 70 years or more is that it's difficult to speak of any international alliances that the Black community has right now, despite the fact that many look sympathetically at our struggle. You don't see our organizations regularly attending the African Union summits in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, or the Caribbean Community Summits that take place in Jamaica, Barbados, Georgetown, Guyana, et cetera. And so we've sort of thrown in our lot with these folks here in North America, even though instinctively we recognize that there's something wrong with that strategy, and that it helps to explain why Joseph R. Biden can do this 180 from talking about George Floyd changing the world to being apprehensive, to put it mildly, about stating the slogan, defund the police. And not only that, but barely mentioning the question of voting rights. It was not politics at its finest hour, I'm afraid to say.
Have you seen the disparity in the Western media coverage when they just came out and say that these are Europeans, these are Christians, these are civilized people, this is Europe, this is not supposed to happen here? And we can draw those same lines when we hear acts of violence that happens stateside when they say this is not supposed to happen here. Can you unpackage that?
Well, with regard to your first point, I take it you're referring to the crisis in Eastern Europe and some of the unfortunate, in fact, racist comments that have been made, not only by US commentators, but interestingly enough on Al Jazeera, which comes out of
that was the only one I was shocked to hear. I mean, from Al Jazeera, bro. So what media can we trust other than independent media?
And I think it's a reflection of the fact that this crisis we're facing right now is ultra serious.
Yes, it is.
You have the Russians going on nuclear alert just a few days ago. You have the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, just today, talking about World War III, and that World War III would be an atomic war, which would basically mean the extinction of human beings, if not all life on planet Earth. And I think that this is a direct result of this, what could be called a pan-European conflict to a certain degree, a la what you quoted Amos Wilson at the top. But I would add the major amendment that, as I said in an article that you can find at Black Agenda Report, which I recommend to your viewers and listeners, ostensibly it's a pan-European conflict between the North Atlantic bloc led by the United States and Moscow, but ultimately in the crosshairs is the People's Republic of China. And that's the difference between what was said in 1986 and what is taking place today. What I mean is, it was President Obama who talked about the pivot to Asia. It was President Trump who upped the ante against China during his 4 years of misrule. You haven't seen that much of a change with regard to President Biden and his policy towards the People's Republic of China. The problem with confronting China directly and frontally is that it has a population 4 times the size of the United States. And if you confront China directly, that means you're confronting Tesla and Microsoft and Apple and KFC and Starbucks and many major US corporations. And so the approach basically is to weaken the partner of China, which is Russia. You might recall what happened on February 4th, 2022, the onset of the Beijing Winter Olympics, where Presidents Putin and Xi had their 38th meeting in the last few years, interestingly enough. And they signed this declaration, 5,000 word declaration that said that their alliance is, quote, without limits, unquote. And so what you see on the one hand is perhaps the beginning of a new hegemon, speaking of the People's Republic of China, taking the place of US imperialism. US imperialism does not intend to go down without a fight. And so therefore you have this crisis over Russia, because the crisis ostensibly was about the ability of the United States through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, to put missiles in Ukraine to target Moscow, just like there are missiles all around Russia targeting Moscow. And so what your viewers and listeners need to realize is that what is at stake is not only regime change in Ukraine, what's at stake is regime change in Moscow as well. And talking about toppling a nuclear regime is quite dangerous. It's more than a notion, but I'm afraid to say that's what we're facing as we speak.
What is the implications to our economy? I always make a distinction between the individuals and our interests and those of an imperialist nation that we find ourselves living in. But what would be the impacts to the economy domestically if this goes on too long? In fact, I even suspect that some of the very sanctions could backfire and have ramifications, because obviously if gas prices go up considerably, that price will affect all goods and services.
You are correct. And in fact, I'm speaking to you from Texas, and the sound you may hear in the background are the corks and champagne bottles popping as the Texas oil men celebrate and dance in the streets at the prospect of gasoline at the pump going up to $6 to $7 a gallon. And if you drive, that's something you're going to have to contend with. Or if you heat your house with natural gas or oil, you should be hoping that there is not the usual wintertime going out with a bang, where in March 21st, there is a huge snowstorm driving temperatures down, because already you see energy prices for home heating going up as well, because Russia is a major supplier of both natural gas and of what becomes gasoline that goes into your car. However, your listeners and viewers should pay careful and close attention to the vote at the United Nations yesterday, where planet Earth, the countries of planet Earth, had an opportunity to weigh in. The headline is that 141 countries voted to deplore what Russia has done in Ukraine. 5 nations, including Russia, Eritrea, East Africa, Belarus, Russia's ally, North Korea, and perhaps Syria, voted with Russia, but there were 35 abstentions, half of whom were from African countries. And I think that bespeaks what you mentioned a moment ago, not only this upset with how refugees from Africa are treated when they try to enter Europe, with regard to the red carpet that's being unrolled for these Ukrainians who, and I recommend you to what Trevor Noah on the Daily Show said just the other day, which has gone viral. You can find it, I'm sure, on TikTok at least, with regard to the racism, the abject racism. And it also leads to why a number of abstentions came from South Asian countries: India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and of course, China abstained as well. Because once again, many of these nations have had it up to their neck with this idea of North Atlantic domination led by the United States. They find it hard to understand why the United States can bomb Libya into smithereens, overthrow the regime, bomb Afghanistan, bomb Iraq, threaten Iran, destroy Yugoslavia on the European continent about 25 odd years ago. At the same time, the press is telling us that what's happening in Europe is unprecedented since 1945. Obviously, they have a bad case of amnesia. They must have forgotten what happened when the United States led the bombing campaign in Yugoslavia. And by the way, in the midst of that bombing campaign, destroyed the Chinese embassy in Serbia, Belgrade, in Southeastern Europe, which was a punch in the nose to China with regard to not getting any big ideas about trying to supplant US imperialism. So I think in terms of our community, the time has come to recognize, number one, that we have a stake in this conflict, not only because we're human beings and people are talking about destroying life on Earth, and we live on Earth, so we have to be engaged. Secondly, we have to be concerned about these energy prices as well. And third, we have to be concerned because the world might be going through a transition. I know it's comfortable for people to think everything always remains the same, but as Africans in North America, you should inherently recognize that things don't remain the same, because it was not inevitable that Africans would wind up in North America speaking a language, English, developed in Northwestern Europe. That was a product of very extended and elongated political and historical and economic change. And we may be living through one of those rare moments where another change is in motion. And if that is the case, and I think it is, what I think the Black community should be doing is paying attention to what the African nations are doing, trying to coordinate with the African nations, because on the one hand, it's inconsistent. You have this discourse amongst many of our people who sees many of the Euro-Americans being actual devils. Okay, fine, they're devils. So what are we going to do about it? I mean, obviously we should lengthen the battlefield. We should be in concert with our friends and allies, not only in the Caribbean and the African Union, but worldwide. Otherwise, it seems to me we're just like sheep being led to slaughter.
There we have it. Now, I think we have a golden opportunity, or a better case rather, for a Green New Deal to break this monopoly that OPEC has over all of these participants in the struggle. But I want to put a pin in that for a moment, because you said that 35 nations, mostly African nations, abstained from their vote in the UN. And this harks back to my memory. I had the pleasure of spending the longest time I spent outside of America in my life was 6 weeks at a leadership conference in Nairobi, Kenya, courtesy of the American Friends Service Committee, the great Quaker organization. And one of the elders that spoke to us said that in apologetic fashion, that up until that time, it was customary for all of the Africans, we talk about post-colonial Africans, to be educated outside of Africa. They went to America, they went to Europe or wherever. And he said that he regretted that because he felt that that we should have our own agenda and our own education to direct where we go from here. But in your book, White Supremacy Confronted, you mentioned something to that effect. You said, why is Russia willing to give us full paid scholarships and Britain is not? Do you think that has any correlation with some of these African nations who abstain and did not just automatically join the West and their position?
Well, I'm happy that you asked that question. For a teaser with regard to what I'm about to articulate in the next minute or two, once again, go to the Black Agenda Report and look at that article that I wrote. It'll only take 5 minutes to read.
I hate to interrupt you, Brother Horne, but you said Black Agenda one time too many. I have to acknowledge, rest in peace to Brother Bruce Dixon and Glenn Ford, some of the founding journalists at Black Agenda Report, and it is one of the trusted independent media outlets. I apologize for the interruption. Please continue.
And what I pointed out here is something I'm afraid to say, that 105 years ago, many Black people, including Black nationalists, recognized, but it's not necessarily recognized today. What I mean is this: after the Western European nations began to get fat on the plundering of Africa and the Americas, speaking of Britain and France and Portugal in the first instance, that they faced a contradiction insofar as they were supposedly world powers, but they were not necessarily the dominant force on their own home continent. Speaking of Russia, if you look at your map, you'll see that most of European territory is Russian. You'll see that Russia's population is about twice the size of the number 2 nation, Germany. You'll see that most of the natural resources in Europe are in Russian territory, including gold, oil, aforementioned natural gas. And so this led repeatedly to attempts to change that contradiction. Napoleon, 200 years ago, invaded Russia and was soundly defeated. A few decades later, you had the War of the Crimea with Britain and France and Turkey tackling Russia. In 1905, you had another turning point in world history when Britain finances Japan's attack on Russia. Japan won. Du Bois, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, Sun Yat-sen of China, Nehru of India all saw that as a turning point in the centuries-long struggle against white supremacy. It led directly to the Russian Revolution of 1917. And of course, Japan delivered the knockout blow to the British Empire, which colonized many of us by defeating it, or excuse me, inflicting mighty blows on it when it seized its cash cows in Hong Kong and Singapore, 1941, 1942. Now, here's the point. Russia was not standing still as this was taking place. Many of us mark the historic defeat of the Italian invaders in East Africa in the 1890s, when they tried to overthrow the regime in what is now Ethiopia, then Abyssinia. What's little understood is that the Abyssinians were able to prevail because Russia was seeking to destabilize the colonial systems of those who they were fighting by arming the Ethiopians to the teeth. India abstained on that vote just yesterday at the General Assembly. And likewise, India was the crown jewel in the colonial empire of London. And London was upset with Russia because it was supporting Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, and the other Indian independence fighters. You have the book to your left, White Supremacy Confronted. A major section in that book, based upon research and the African National Congress archives in the eastern section of South Africa, by the way, at Fort Hare University, the alma mater of Nelson Mandela and Robert Mugabe, amongst others. The ANC and other independence fighters in Southern Africa, Angola, Mozambique, et cetera, would not have been able to prevail but for being armed by Moscow. So you've had this major contradiction that is in the process of being resolved, because right now, the North Atlantic Bloc is no longer willing to accept that Moscow is on side with regard to their form, that is to say, Washington's form of imperialism. Of course, since the overthrow of the Communist Party in 1991, Russia is bidding to be a capitalist country as well, but it's not the same as the North Atlantic Bloc. And so that's what's being worked out right now. And that's one of the reasons why you had that quote where you quoted someone suggesting that Russia, you have Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, which was started some decades ago.
Patrice Lumumba University is in Moscow?
Of course. It was started during the Cold War to honor the late Congolese leader, to educate a generation of Africans. And of course, the United States responded. That's one of the reasons why Barack Obama Sr. wound up at the University of Hawaii. That is to say, Washington was trying to keep up in this contest. And so therefore it began to attract Africans to these shores, many of them winding up within walking distance of where you're sitting at Howard University on the Hill in Georgia Avenue. So once again, I think that this should be a moment when our young people in particular decide to step up their game, decide that at this fraught moment, when we're seriously talking about the extinction of all humanity, there's no time like the present to not only begin a systematic process of organizing and protesting, but also of study, because that's the ammunition that we're going to need ultimately to prevail in this decades-long, centuries-long struggle.
Well, I just want to thank you for informing me and our audience about the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. I'm going to have to educate myself furthermore on that. But I also want to give a shout out to Harry Belafonte. It was his 95th birthday this week. And I was listening to an interview with him with Kojo Nnamdi. And he goes on to say that there was a young Kenyan activist who was petitioning, this is again during that post-colonial struggle, to get more support from the U.S. government for the struggle in Kenya for the liberation from Britain's control. And they started an exchange program where young Kenyans came to the States again to be educated. And Harry Belafonte was instrumental in supporting that program. And one of the Kenyans that they brought over to be educated was Barack Obama Sr. So had they not had that activism, then we might not have seen Barack Obama Jr. Because he wouldn't have met his mother. So it was because of that program. So I just want to throw that out there, a little bit of history I learned this week. But what would it take for people in the African diaspora, as Bob Marley would say, to become a small axe with these towering pillars of imperialism?
That's more than a notion. It may take longer than we have today. But I'll begin by saying that our organizations are rather weak right now. We really need more energized Black student organizations, particularly going back to the State of the Union. I didn't hear anything about the multi-trillion-dollar student debt, which means that anybody who's lucky enough to get to college, oftentimes when they leave, they have this albatross around their neck of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of dollars in debt. We need more student organizing. We need more tenant organizing. Evictions are taking place at a breakneck speed, at least in my part of North America, perhaps in yours too. If we do not want to see a further explosion of homelessness and all the misery attended to it, we need stronger tenant organizations. We need stronger labor unions. That is to say that we need more organizations that press for better working conditions and higher wages. And for all of these organizations, be it labor unions, student unions, tenant unions, they all need to have a global agenda. They just can't be stuck in pushing for their important needs, important as they might be. That is to say, shelter, income, education, because all of those factors are contingent upon and dependent upon having a healthy global environment. Because if the planet is destroyed, well, then that solves everything. There's no longer any need to struggle for a $20 an hour wage or a $25 an hour wage, because nobody will be here anymore. So in sum and substance, that would be my response to your intelligent question.
And I wanted to point out that we had free college tuition in this country, and the reason we don't now is because of Ronald Reagan. And I wish I could find a quote that he spoke against college educating activists. And I think that's part of the reason why we don't have the type of activism, intellectual areas now, because it seems like the best of us are going to become cogs in the wheel. They joined the military industrial complex and the defense industry. They're going where the money is. Some of our greatest minds don't have anywhere else to go. So we need some institutional building for dismantling and decolonizing the situation that we find ourselves in. I would love to have a deeper conversation on that, because I don't know where to even start with that. If you wanted to care to respond, because I don't know where to begin.
Well, when I was much younger, it was quite the thing to have study groups. People 5, 6, 7, maybe more, would pick out a text, read chapters, get together once a week to discuss it. To the best of my knowledge and understanding, study groups are not as popular today as they once were. But we really need a revival of that trend, because as I mentioned once again in that piece in Black Agenda Report, one of the things that I counseled is that I'm not even sure if our people, including leaders of organizations, realize that if you're an oppressed group, as we are, you have to be able to take advantage of turning points in world history, which is what we're going through right now. I'm not even sure people realize that fundamental point, which is like the ABCs of politics. And so if you don't realize that you're supposed to take advantage of an international crisis, well, then that international crisis basically passes you by, or as they say in the United States right now, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
There you have it.
I'm afraid to say that we're going to be tasty morsels for some that are at the table as we get swallowed, masticated, digested.
Wow. I want to share a quote from Madiba, also known as Nelson Mandela. He said, "The enemies of countries in the West are not ours," which further underscores why we cannot go with this binary notion of us versus them. And we need to make a clear distinction. I'll hark back to Malcolm X saying, "What's the matter, boss? We sick?" And so how do you think that we can, and I really like the study group. I'm going to put some energy behind that, by the way, Professor Horne. So thank you for blessing us with that. And hopefully some of our listeners will do the same. You know, our motto here, We Act Radio, is to do something. And that's something that definitely can be done right where people are. All right. I'm sorry. You got to understand, We Act Radio is broadcasting live on the radical side of Martin Luther King Avenue. This is the radio station that you saw in the film, Spike Lee film, Do the Right Thing. I'm Sam Jackson. So our storefront window, we got people that wave, and the speakers are in the street. So people are hearing your voices and responding to our conversation. So we want to acknowledge that. But he says that, the separation between our identity and our politics from the dominant culture. How can we begin to separate ourselves and decolonize our minds? Ivan Van Sertima says that not only did they colonize our minds, they colonized our imagination.
Oh, well, I mentioned study groups. Which presupposes that people are reading books and articles. But I think we also need to pay attention to the audio visual. I mean, for example, over the decades, there have been an enormous number of films that are produced that should be part of our everyday conversation. I think of the film Burn, B-U-R-N, probably one of the most stirring films produced about slave revolts. I think of the Battle of Algiers, which the Black Panther Party used to use as part of their political education classes. And in fact, as you probably know, the Black Panther Party wound up having a headquarters in Algiers, in North Africa, for a number of years. And those who were being persecuted in North America found shelter in Algiers, North Africa, just like those who were persecuted in North America, like Assata Shakur, found shelter and exile in Cuba, for example. And that is necessary because if you look at the history of struggles, you're reading the history of struggles in Southern Africa, you may know that before the overthrow of apartheid, the resistance leaders in South Africa, they had offices in New York, Washington, in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in Moscow, and London, in China. And if we're really serious about struggle, well, then we'll try to walk in their footsteps. We'll try to educate ourselves through systematic study, through systematic screening and viewing of this plethora of movies that have been bequeathed to us over the decades. And ultimately, we will try to internationalize our struggle. We'll try to lengthen the battlefield. Because if you look at the history of slavery, for example, most of the anti-slavery leaders, Black leaders, including many who lived in Washington, D.C., they spent a considerable amount of time crusading overseas, ginning up opposition to slavery in capitals around the world. The same holds true with regard to Jim Crow. That is to say, the US system of apartheid, which used to be a cardinal feature in Washington, D.C., by the way, the nation's capital. That is to say, there were these concerted campaigns overseas to put pressure on the United States. You mentioned Malcolm X. He, in the latter part of his life, articulated the idea of taking the United States to the United Nations over the question of genocide. Of course, Paul Robeson had done the same thing, circa 1950, 1951. That put enormous pressure on the United States when you put it in the International Court of Justice, small I, small c, small j. So I think that we know, or at least some of us know, what needs to be done. The question is, do we have the political will to do it?
Well, in making that differentiating our agenda from the dominant society, I think we need to make sure that we don't cower away from terms that they feel are unacceptable. Just by the mentioning of communism, people still cringe like it's the McCarthy age. Angela Davis, to this day, identifies as being a communist. And you mentioned Shada Shakur, she found refuge in communist Cuba. Socialist, I would rather say, in Cuba. Robert Williams found refuge in communist China. And we all know about Paul Robeson and his relationship with Russia and his famous, he was brought before the McCarthy witch hunt in that debate. But I wanted to share a quote this is not an ally of the progressive community by any stretch of the imagination, but even a broke clock is right 2 times a day. This is from Milton Friedman. He says, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are laying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. What opportunities do you think that this current crisis in Ukraine and its ripple effects around the globe are presenting to us in terms of an opportunity in the midst of crisis?
Well, the opportunity is this. Our oppressors, particularly those who hold power in Washington, D.C., are rather nervous right now. And they should be nervous because they've maneuvered this country into a corner from which there are few easy exits. As a result, there are opportunities for our organizations and our leaders to do what they should have been doing all along, which is going to the African Union summits that take place in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia regularly, having an office in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, just like, as I said, anti-slavery campaigners and anti-Jim Crow campaigners had offices all over the world. And this was during an era when most of Africa was colonized. And so it was difficult to have an office in Africa, for example, because it was ruled mostly by Britain, France, Portugal, et cetera. We need to do the same thing with regard to the Caribbean. We need to encourage our youth, particularly our youth under the age of 18, to begin to learn languages other than English. That is to say, it'll be easier for us to build bonds across the oceans and bridges across the seas if we are conversant in multiple languages, for example. I don't have to mention what these languages are, but I can if people are interested. And certainly, I think that then that becomes an antidote to some of these crises that we're now facing. There was just an article in the paper the other day. Some of you might find it ho-hum, others might find it shocking, about the epidemic of carjacking, for example, and how increasingly teenagers are involved in carjacking, and that many of them just see it as a game because after they take the car, they just take it for a spin and then just abandon it. And so it's not like they're going to take the car and then you maybe use it to drive to school or drive to work. And then, of course, all it does is lead to a lengthy prison term where all manner of hellish activities take place. And so when I speak of this agenda that I'm laying out as an antidote, what I'm saying is that it's a way, indirectly, if not directly, to deal with some of these social ills that are afflicting our community, in addition to being a way out politically to help to rescue the entire community from this deep hole in which we find ourselves.
So and I have to ask, what's some of those languages? Because I'm assuming that one of them has to be Mandarin, since 1 out of 5 people on the planet speaks Mandarin. Am I correct? Is it one of the languages that you suggest?
Of course, and of course, Kiswahili, which is becoming the lingua franca, the common language from Kenya down the East Indian coast, down the Indian Ocean coast to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, for example, Spanish, French, Portuguese, for example. I mean, it's no secret as to what these languages might be. Many of them are being taught in the high schools in Washington, D.C., some of the elementary schools. I used to live in North Carolina, where in the elementary schools, they were teaching what you refer to as Mandarin Chinese. And so students from the age of 5 were learning that language and then taking it on through into the college level, which opens up enormous opportunities. Certainly, it's not a simple thing, but it's easier for a 5-year-old to learn a foreign language than a 25-year-old to learn a foreign language for various reasons having to do with the circuits in your brain. Mm-hmm. So I think it's apparent what we need to do. The question is, do we have the will to do it?
Absolutely. And I want to point out to our audience that Brazil has the largest population of Africans outside of Africa, and they speak Portuguese. So we're looking at Ukraine. How are you perceiving what's to come? Because I don't see an end of this anytime soon. There's a quote, another one I wanted to share. It says, you can blow and you can extinguish a fire, or you can blow and you can make a fire. So we're in a precarious situation where it can go either way. What is your take on where do we go from here in terms of the Ukraine crisis?
Well, first of all, let's deal with the worst case scenarios. The worst case scenario is a nuclear war. And
don't look up.
Oh, exactly. I mean, I know people don't want to deal with that because it's too horrible to contemplate, but we need to realize that wars oftentimes don't happen through intentionality. They oftentimes happen through accident, through flukes, through happenstance. And right now, that's what we seem to be spinning towards. That's the worst case scenario. Another scenario would be regime change in Moscow. Now, that, if it happens, would only tighten the screws against China. And given the fact that a lot of what you buy in terms of Apple phones, notebooks, clothes come from China, you heard Mr. Biden talk about inflation, that is to say prices going up, like the price of gasoline at the pump going up. Well, if they tighten the screws on China, then we're in a brand new ball game. And another scenario would be regime change in Kiev, in Ukraine itself. But that would not end the conflict, because I think the United States and its allies would feel compelled to try to sponsor a guerrilla war in Ukraine. Remember, they did the same thing in Afghanistan, and you saw how that worked out. That is to say, they helped to weaken the Soviet Union, leading to its collapse. But then on September 11, 2001, the allies of the United States, we are told, attacked Washington, D.C. and New York City, killing over 3,000 people. So most of the scenarios that I've sketched are rather grim, but this bespeaks the deep hole in which we find ourselves. I mean, you just can't smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day for 30 years and then go to the doctor and expect the doctor to come up with a miracle cure. Mm-hmm. And politically, that's what we've been doing, actually longer. And so we just can't snap our fingers like a TV show and come up with a brand new scenario. We're in deep trouble right now, I'm afraid to say, brothers and sisters.
And I want to point out that we're not just talking about simply a nuclear exchange, because we have to point out that the Chernobyl disaster was a nuclear accident that occurred on April 26 in 1986. And it is considered the worst nuclear disaster in history, both in cost and casualties, and that is in Ukraine. And so there could be a situation where just, and there's several nuclear power plants in Ukraine, I should point out and add, any number of them being damaged could expose radiation that could make not only Ukraine, but parts of Europe unhospitable. So there's a number of grave scenarios here, but we're looking to see if this is also a decolonizing of the world superpowers and a rise of the global South, potentially to free themselves from this dependency of being, again, where OPEC is calling the shots. Because if the global South became producers of energy rather than consumers of energy, that changes the ball game. Do you see that factoring into this situation at all?
Well, first of all, with regard to OPEC, I mean, the leading members are Saudi Arabia, of course. Russia is part of what's called OPEC Plus, that is to say OPEC plus other members. But if you look historically at the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, you've had leading roles being played by Angola, by Nigeria, by Algeria, for example. Now, admittedly, even though you have considerable equity in petroleum resources controlled by Africans, there is no doubt that ExxonMobil and Shell play a role in shaping the price of a barrel of oil. And I think that this harkens back to what you said a moment or two ago, which is that it's not a moment too soon for inaugurating a Green New Deal. That is to say, to try to move towards renewable energy, away from coal and petroleum and towards solar and wind. But once again, other contradictions will emerge, because if you look at solar panels, for example, and if you look at green energy in general, right now that's dominated by the People's Republic of China. Now, Mr. Biden, at his State of the Union address, made some passing remarks about trying to address that. There are bills in Congress dealing with that. But as you know, you have this troglodyte caucus of the Republican Party that feels that they are God's children and they don't have to work to survive, that God will smile upon them because they're God's children and this is God's country. Well, I'm afraid to say that some of those people who think like that, they're at the wheel of the vehicle on which we're now riding and don't realize that we're headed for an iceberg. I mean, that's the problem with this present crisis. I mean, it would be one thing if we were outside of the United States and we could look on more objectively and dispassionately about the collapse of the United States, but we are here in the belly of the beast. And so we have to be attuned and alert to these catastrophes, which the leadership is leading us towards. And as if this were a movie, we're going to have to grab the steering wheel away from those who are now controlling it, because they're leading us towards a catastrophe. And if we don't grab the steering wheel, we're going to go down with the ship right along with them.
Well, many of us are familiar with Martin Luther King's last speech, or at least we should be, since that's one of the two speeches that the mass media acknowledges. But his next to his last speech, which was delivered right here in Washington, D.C., March 31st, 1968, it was entitled Remaining Awake During a Great Revolution. He goes on to say that far too often people find themselves living in periods of great social change, but yet they fail to determine the new ideas, the new mental responses that the new situation demands. They end up sleeping through a revolution. Do you concur that we are in the midst of a revolution? And how do we grab that wheel, as you so eloquently described?
I think we're at a turning point in history. Just to go briefly through the history of Black people in North America, a turning point comes when the first Africans arrive on these shores, some dated from 1619, others dated from 1565 in St. Augustine, Florida, under Spanish rule. Others dated from the 1520s when the Spanish from their perch in Santo Domingo sailed northward to what is now South Carolina, with Africans in tow who then revolt and defect to the Native American side. Others trace it back before 1520 because of these escalator type waves that allow one easily to cross the Atlantic. Whatever the case, the arrival of Africans in North America was one turning point. The abolition of enslavement was another, 1865. That was another turning point. What's going to happen after you become slaves? Another is the retreat, the erosion of Jim Crow. In the 1950s, 1960s, you mentioned Martin Luther King, who symbolizes that era of the erosion of Jim Crow. And another is today, when you see what might be the retreat, if not the collapse of the US empire, and if not the extinction of all humanity in nuclear war. If that's not a turning point, I don't know what is. So what do? Well, I have to revert to what I said a moment or two ago. It's well past time to step up organizing in different sectors, be it in labor unions, be it in tenants unions, be it in student unions, all the rest. Because if we don't do that, as I said, we'll wind up just being a sheep led to slaughter.
Well, if that's the case, that brings to my final quote. That's from Bert Brecht. He said, "Those who are against fascism without being against capitalism, who lament over the barbarism that comes out of barbarism, are like people who wish to eat their veal without slaughtering the calf." And I think in America that summarizes the privilege that we have here. I want to wrap this up on a high note. As if we could, get some feel-good energy out of such dreaded conversations, but it's necessary. One, how can people follow you and support your work? Two, what is some of the things that should start off in a study group in terms of a list? You mentioned a couple of films. I'm proud to say that I'm familiar with the Battles of Algiers is one of my favorites. So I leave it to you. What is our homework assignment, good professor?
Well, with regard to myself, I mean, there are a number of Facebook pages devoted to my work. Indeed, this conversation, assuming that the link is sent to me, will be on one of my Facebook pages.
You can trust and believe, sir.
In the next 24 to 48 hours. With regard to lectures, ditto. I mean, many of my lectures are found on YouTube, for example, many than I would care to recount. I've published about 30 plus books that are still in print. They're easy to find. Mm-hmm. It would be false modesty if I were to ignore some of my own work with regard to study groups, because my work, it starts with the 1500s and goes forward to yesterday. And so one of the early works that I would recommend for a study group is my book, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. If that sounds too heavy, try my book on boxing, The Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racketeering, and the Political Economy of Boxing. Or if you're culturally and artistically inclined, try my book on music, Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music. That is to say, I would recommend those books. I would recommend Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. I would recommend Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I would recommend the book by Du Bois, Black Reconstruction. I mean, the list is long.
The list is long. And one of the good things about the pandemic, another crisis that created opportunity, I think it was the first time that poor people got a vacation. And some of us caught up on some reading. We had time to sit and think. And I think that's one of the cracks in the dam of American imperialism and empire that we're seeing fall right now, because Humpty Dumpty has fallen down, and all the king's men are not going to be able to put them back together again. So Professor Horne, I want to thank you for joining me here today. And one more time, you share your contact information. And I wanted to wrap up by saying, you can sit and watch the garden grow, or you can get out there and be the gardener. So this is We Act Radio. We're always imploring our listenership to do something. And suffice it to say, it takes courageous people to take calculated risks to do something. Your contact information, sir, and I'll leave the last word to you.
Well, just put my name into a search engine on Facebook or on Google, and I'm not underground yet. So I'm as you have found, I'm not that difficult to find. I'm not that difficult to locate.
Thank goodness you are not, and we applaud you for many more rotations around the sun. And we're going to get through this again. This was not your first time on We Act Radio, and hopefully it will not be your last. Continued success to you. Stay safe, stay strong, stay woke, my brother.
Same to you. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Peace.